This is the BioCentury Show.
The BioCentury Show is brought to you by the 11th China Healthcare Summit. This October, BioCentury, Bay Helix, and Insights partner, McKinsey & Company, invite you to Shanghai to network, partner, and debate with industry peers and get a first-hand look at China's life sciences ecosystem as deal-making between China and the West accelerates.
Hello, I'm Steve Usdin, BioCentury's Washington editor. I've been reporting about the life sciences and public policy for a long time, and much of what I report about is part of a continuum, twists and turns, and a long road. Sometimes something happens that's clearly different, that marks an inflection point for science or medicine, and it grabs the public's attention. FDA's accelerated approval of Aduhelm aducanumab for Alzheimer's disease in June 2021, and Medicare's subsequent decisions about coverage was one of those inflection points. Enough time has passed, I think, to get some perspective on it. That's why I'm speaking with Lee Fleisher, founder of Rubrum Advising and former chief medical officer at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. At CMS, Dr. Fleisher made some of the key decisions about coverage of Aduhelm and of the next monoclonal antibody therapy for Alzheimer's, lecanemab. Lee, I want to start a discussion today with aducanumab and ask you first to walk us through the decisions you and your colleagues made. Starting with, how did it get on your radar? Were you aware of the accelerated approval before it happened, or did CMS start thinking about coverage only after the approval?
No, the team and the coverage and analysis group led by Tamara Sierra-Jensen is a phenomenal group. It's small, it contains physicians, it contains scientists, epidemiologists, and we meet with the FDA quite frequently, and the group reports to me as the senior career official and chief medical officer for CMS. And so we were aware, and when the drug did get approved, we had a lot of incoming from multiple sources saying that they would like a formal decision about monoclonals for Alzheimer's disease, because if we left it to the individual MACs, the individual Medicare administrative contractors, there could be differences between one region of the country and another, as well as the decision made for a national coverage decision influences Medicare Advantage. And we were also hearing from AHIP and the Medicare Advantage space that it would be good to have a national decision really to ensure equity across the entire ecosystem.
So CMS's decision to restrict use to a tightly defined clinical trials was highly controversial, to put it bluntly. It essentially put aducanumab out of reach for most seniors. There was some applause, especially from people who thought that FDA shouldn't have granted accelerated approval in the first place. And there was condemnation from Alzheimer's advocacy groups, members of Congress, the biopharma industry. George Vredenberg, the chair of patient group Us Against Alzheimer's, said, if drugs go through the FDA, get approved, and then have to go through another clinical trial process to get coverage, then no one's going to invest in this space. This is not a tolerable situation. FDA was charged with this decision. They made the decision. CMS should honor it. What's your response to people who thought that? I'm sure you heard that and a lot more.
I heard that and a lot more. And let me just say, and of course, I reported to the administrator, Chiquita Brooks-LaSure at the time, that we had lots of conversations, and the decision to move forward really reflected a question about the endpoints in the FDA label. The trial was done in a smaller population. It did not have the diversity from an ethnic and racial perspective that you would see in the Alzheimer's population. It was a broader label than was the clinical trial itself. So I do not think this will be repeated, maybe never again, or incredibly rarely. But the fact that amyloid, which was at the time extremely controversial as the true etiology of Alzheimer's and reduction of amyloid, whether it would really lead to it's important to understand that while FDA is reasonably safe and effective, CMS is reasonable and necessary for the diagnosis or treatment of an illness or injury. So there are different statutory authorities. In this case, as we talked to the NIH, as we talked to the experts in the field, it became clear that there was a lot of controversy about this particular accelerated approval endpoint. And therefore, the team looked at the evidence and they believed at the time, and this was the proposed decision, that it should only be covered in a clinical trial to continue to understand whether or not it works, where it works, and for whom it works, and the infrastructure needed given the risks of the drug compared to the benefits, such that can you give it everywhere? What type of care team, what type of resources do you need given ARIA or the Alzheimer-related imaging events that occurred, the so-called brain bleeds?
So, you mentioned concerns about the endpoint, concerns about the scope of the trial. A couple of thoughts about that. One is it isn't unusual for clinical trials to have a population that's narrower than what's on the label. I think probably that's the case for almost all drugs. And secondly, it's not even unusual for FDA to use a surrogate endpoint for an accelerated approval that doesn't have broad consensus around, at least that there's a lot of controversy around different surrogate endpoints. So why do you think that this isn't going to happen again?
Well, for like cancer, there's widespread agreement that tumor burden is an acceptable endpoint. I'm watching in the cancer space the idea of ctDNA being something that's in evolution, and at some point, I think there will be widespread belief. I think in the Alzheimer's space, this was unusual, and we did do lots of listening sessions. So I think that my hope is that there really is much broader consensus than in this particular circumstance. I mean, many of the individuals have been talking about tau as an important protein. And in fact, we continue to see questions about what is truly the etiology of Alzheimer's and whether this is an epiphenomenon or not. And I defer to the experts on that.
So a lot of people, for example, Scott Gottlieb, the former FDA commissioner, came out and said that that they believed that CMS had exceeded its authority, that reasonable and necessary doesn't mean that they should conduct their own scientific analyses. And then they also kind of questioned CMS's medical expertise, whether the agency has staff on hand or access to experts who are competent to make these decisions for the whole American people in the case of a drug that's only used by Medicare patients. What would be your responses to that?
I can assure you, although the team at the coverage group is small, we did have a neurologist, we do have epidemiologists on staff. The team really went out and got solicited expert opinion throughout the entire country. We had tours to major Alzheimer's centers, and it's an open process. After the national coverage analysis is open, there's a 30-day period in which there's discussion, and in which we solicit input. And then they go back and they make further decisions until they come out with a proposed decision. So all I can say is that I am very confident that the team who reported to me at that time, as well as I, went and listened to the experts throughout the country. And in fact, if you've looked at some of the newer drugs, they actually have changed the label and they have continued to ask for post-approval data collection. That was not true on the original Aduhelm drug. So I think there continues to be solicitation of input of how best to utilize this drug.
So I know that FDA and CMS also say that price doesn't play a role in your decisions, that you cover things based on whether they're reasonable and necessary, not on their price. I find that a little bit hard to believe, especially in this case when Biogen came out initially with a price of $50,000 a year for treatment. If that had been, I don't know, $1,000 or I don't know, $10, it seems unlikely to me that this whole process would have happened. It seems like it would have just kind of like slid through. Am I wrong about that?
Well, you are, because basically what you're saying, and I have publicly said, price does not influence the decision for coverage. What is clear is that the burden as far as the population and the total cost does influence whether a national coverage analysis is opened and whether a decision is made. So if you trust me as, an academic who then had a major role at CMS, I can assure you that the national coverage analysis, and there should be in short order, I've heard from Tamara that they will be putting out how they prioritize what gets open. That is influenced by burden, but not the final decision. At least I can assure you for this drug, it did not influence it.
So that's an interesting distinction. Maybe you can explore it a little bit more. So you're saying that price doesn't affect the decision, but it does affect the choice of whether or not a national coverage decision, a uniform decision for the whole country is made.
Not price, burden, the burden to the healthcare system. And again, there will be guidance posted shortly on the decision of what gets opened.
So when Aduhelm received traditional approval, CMS said that it would institute a kind of a two-tiered process for antibody therapies for Alzheimer's. Those with full approval would get a so-called enhanced access and coverage, meaning that they would be covered as long as physicians collected information in a registry. But if they were approved through accelerated approval, then they would be restricted to NIH or FDA approved trials.
Let me correct you right there, because it's not Aduhelm. It was the proposed decision focused on accelerated approval of this class of drugs. Based upon the feedback we received, including from patients and others, they wanted to assure that when it got full approval, any drug got full approval in this class, that they had immediate access, which is why in the final decision, the final national coverage decision, it actually included a pathway to get access the day it was approved by the FDA.
So, and then part of that also was, at least for lecanemab, was the design of a kind of innovative system for collecting real-world evidence after it was on the market, so that CMS and so that patients and physicians could learn about how these drugs actually perform in the real world. Can you talk about that process?
Yeah, and again, it wasn't just lecanemab. It's any drug that received full approval. And then there is a process for reconsideration. But essentially, for any national coverage decision that has coverage with evidence development, that CMS asks a series of questions. I believe it was 4 in the decision for the monoclonals, and that any group can propose a study. In fact, there can be multiple studies. So there could be a study approved, and CMS works with the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. Could be approved. That could be a smaller study. It could be a national study. It could be multiple studies, and it doesn't have to be a registry, etc. At the time that it appeared it would be approved, and we were in conversations continuously with the FDA, we being CMS, there was no studies proposed. So at the request of the administrator, and I thank her for that, she said, can we propose a study and develop a study? And in talking with a group, and we worked with Yale on this, we came up with something that was very simple. It was collecting, I think it was approximately 10 data elements. It would be combined with Medicare claims. The collection would be almost identical to what you would collect as a provider for a patient. It would occur only every 6 months for a period of 2 years, which was the study design, working again with the group, I believe it was Yale. And that was stood up. It takes somewhere between 5 and 8 minutes to complete the data entry. And then any patient in the country could be enrolled and would be paid for by the Medicare program.
And so do you think that, how long is it going to be until we start seeing some information back from that and actually get a sense of how lecanemab, because that's the only one that's on the market now, how it actually performs in the real world?
You know, it's a 2-year study is how it was designed. I think that it'll be important that the data gets put into the VDRC, or the data warehouse, I believe is the plan. I'm no longer obviously at CMS. Was the plan to make it available for researchers to analyze the data. So my hope is that shortly after the data becomes available in that data warehouse, we'll have that answer.
Great. Well, thanks. We're gonna come back and we're gonna talk about some other things as soon as we do. Thank you.
The BioCentury Show is brought to you by
From ADCs to bispecifics, deal-making between China and the West is accelerating. At the same time, the world is changing, requiring new strategies to succeed. This October, BioCentury, Bay Helix, and Insights partner McKinsey & Company invite you to Shanghai for the 11th China Healthcare Summit. Network, partner, and debate with industry peers and get a first-hand look at China's life sciences ecosystem. Register today at biocenturychinasummit.com. Can't visit Shanghai? Register instead for a digital pass.
We're back with Dr. Lee Fleisher. Lee, I wanted to ask you one more question on the Alzheimer's thing. Well, actually, it's more broadly. It's about accelerated approvals. Couple of things. One is, do you think that coverage decisions and CMS coverage decisions going forward will consistently be different, or will they question accelerated approvals compared to traditional approvals? And another question is, and I know this isn't something that CMS would do, but I'm wondering, now that you're out of CMS, what you think about it. There have been proposals for differential pricing for drugs that receive accelerated approval versus traditional approval. And so both of those questions, what do you think about accelerated approval in general going forward for coverage decisions? And what do you think about the idea of having differential pricing for accelerated approval?
Those are both great questions. You know, I really do think this is an incredibly unusual decision. I think that most of the accelerated approvals are well accepted. I worked with the Bipartisan Policy Center. We had come up with a proposal to make sure CMS and FDA work well together. I think we published something in, I believe it was MedPage Today, on this issue. And I think that there should be greater alignment around an outcome of accelerated approval. I think the NIH, FDA, working with CMS and other agencies, can really assure that that's a well-accepted outcome. And I think it will be unusual to see that occur again in the near future. I think there'll be better alignment.
I think,
yeah.
So just on that, I mean, my feeling on it is that the fundamental issue is that FDA should get scientific and medical consensus about the value of an endpoint before it uses it as an approval endpoint for an accelerated approval endpoint. And if it did that in this case, and if it does it in the future, the controversy will be a lot less.
I think we're saying the same thing. Yeah, so I agree entirely. And I think that was the issue when we went out and talked to national experts on this.
So what about your thoughts on differential pricing for drugs that have received accelerated approval, and the idea that they would be lower, and then when they get traditional approval, that the prices might be dialed up?
You know, it's a great theoretical idea. The question is, how do you do it? how do you decide that the original price is a reasonable price and you get more if you get full approval? A little different than a warranty. And I've written a little bit about the gene therapy space. I think that if CMS and CMMI and other places can figure out that pricing model, that would be ideal. I just don't know if anyone will know how to effectively do it.
So another issue, you mentioned it at the beginning of our conversation, where I think CMS coverage decisions are likely to be controversial. Liquid biopsies for cancer, these are tests that hopefully can detect multiple forms of cancer from DNA that's circulating in blood. What do you think are the issues for, well, one for approvals and two for coverage decisions around those kind of multi-cancer detection?
It's interesting. I've been in a number of meetings with Friends of Cancer Research, and they've been publishing a lot and working a lot in this space. And I really give them a lot of credit looking at the ability of the reliability and the validity of a lot of these new measures. And I think that we are on a trajectory to which they will be well accepted. But even when I talk to many of the scientists, they say we're not quite there yet. But I think that over the next 3 to 5 years, maybe sooner, they will become an acceptable endpoint and will be used by CMS as part of the accelerated approval pathway to get immediate coverage.
And is there an issue at CMS between distinguishing between something that's a screening test and something that's a diagnostic? And are there issues around resolving that for liquid biopsies?
The interesting thing is Medicare is a defined benefit. And what I mean by that, the Social Security Act, what Congress has authorized CMS to pay for, is defined in statute. And there are certain benefit categories. I spent some of my time at CMS discussing that. The screening actually requires the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force to approve it so that there's no copay, as opposed to some of the diagnostic areas. But for example, you can have a single liquid biopsy for colorectal cancer screening. In fact, as you saw, we had actually put into place during my tenure a sensitivity and specificity threshold that if any test reached it, it got automatic coverage, which recently happened. But there is no benefit category for multi-cancer detection tests. After some of the recent Supreme Court decisions, I think we're looking for Congress, because they are working on a statute that would say you can pay for multi-cancer detection tests. So it's my belief that that needs to occur in order for CMS to clearly cover it.
So another thing that you mentioned, coverage of gene and cell therapies. Some of these therapies can cost over $1 million. They're all expensive. There are also expenses for hospitalization and other kinds of care that is associated with them. On the one hand, there's tremendous promise. In some cases, they're once and done lifetime cures. In some cases, they haven't lived up to the hope. Efficacy has faded over time, or there have been unexpected safety issues that have emerged. How do you think CMS and society should think about and go about covering and paying for these gene and cell therapies that, again, are extraordinarily expensive, in some cases extraordinarily effective, in some cases don't live up to the hopes that people have for them?
I've written a lot about this idea of how do we get innovation faster to the public, but collect the data to say where it works. And in the cell and gene therapy space, as you've talked about, this is a difficult one. How long does it last? What's the guarantee? Can it last an entire lifetime? And secondly, there are certain restrictions on using it twice. If a newer or better therapy, it may be prevented from actually getting a second treatment. And the third thing is that I've learned in the pediatric space, I have a close family member up at Boston Children's. They provide care for a very large area. You may want the actual delivery of the gene, the therapy itself, to be at a Boston Children's, I'm in Philadelphia, to be at a CHOP, to be at a major center, but the care will actually be back in their hometown, some of which cross state lines, which, of course, this is a very important Medicaid issue. So I was very proud when CMMI came up with their proposal, and thank you, Liz Fowler and her team and the administrator. And so I think it's important to come up with novel payment strategies, but I think all of us would like to continue collecting that data. We have to do it in a way that patients trust, that the data is really being used to inform further patient care, and that it's not a barrier to treatment.
So that proposal you mentioned, that's basically for the states to kind of band together, state Medicaid programs to band together, and for CMS to help them work out contracts with cell and gene therapy providers, manufacturers.
Absolutely, and particularly in the sickle cell area. I mean, people have said, should some of these diseases be, Medicare covered so that there be a national plan? We have end-stage renal disease, but we don't have many others. So that would take another act of Congress. So I thought this was an excellent proposal to get that covered.
Another question, I don't think we can talk about, medicine or almost anything in life today without talking about AI. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about, more generally, your thoughts and concerns about AI in medicine, how to ensure that we have access to innovation rapidly, as you mentioned, equitably and safely.
So for full disclosure, I'm a member of the Health IT Advisory Committee for the ONC. I co-chair the Safety Committee of the Coalition for Health AI, and I'm a consultant to the FDA Digital Health Advisory Committee. So
you've thought about this.
I thought about this, yes. And I work with several policy groups in DC. I even wrote a piece that said, I'm concerned that AI in a couple ways. One is it's got to be FAVES, fair, accessible, valid, equitable, and safe, and particularly safe. And I'm concerned that we haven't trained people to use AI in what I call a Bayesian method, in which they actually understand that this is just an input to make a decision. I think it's fabulous that we're going to be able to diagnose rare diseases and look for treatment in a much more robust way than we could in the past. But, we always used to be taught in medical school that as you go through each disease or each group, you're going to say, oh, I have that disease. And the question is, if the algorithm comes up with something, you still need human input to say, does this make sense? For example, if the first few patients with COVID, if the algorithm wasn't trained on a COVID-like virus, would that have been the initial diagnosis? If it's not trained on the right population, you may get the wrong diagnosis. So that the training set is so important. I listen a lot, and the national coordinator, Mickey Tripathi, has talked a lot about assurance labs to make sure that the output is really based upon good input, and particularly around generative AI as opposed to the traditional predictive AI. So a couple of things. I think it's really going to be very important to train the next generation of how to use it better rather than just a textbook. I think it's going to be very important to think about, from a safety standpoint, how do we get input that as we scale up the use of these algorithms and we see errors, not just hallucinations, but it's not trained on the right data set, it's not used in the right fashion. How do we have input back to the governing bodies of our hospitals if it's used within a hospital setting? How do we ensure that, just like a drug or device where we report to the manufacturer if it actually has a problem, sort of all those safety checks, how do we make sure it goes back to the original developer to say you need to tweak the algorithm? How do we ensure that we stay up to date and that if an algorithm is sunsetted, it's still not used in that population. We don't have enough informaticians in this country to actually populate every hospital in every equitable area. I work at a major academic medical center. We have lots of computer scientists and informatics individuals and people with deep expertise. What happens, in a small or rural inner city that don't have those resources? So we actually put out a piece, a colleague of mine, Nicoletta Economou, and I said the conditions of participation, which every hospital is required to who participates in Medicare to be surveyed to, they really have an obligation to have the governing body ensure that AI is deployed correctly. And all those things that I talked about actually happen, that there's the right feedback loops so that it really stays up to date and used by the right person. The thing go ahead.
So you seem, maybe this is where you're going, you seem to be thinking that AI in medicine is going to be in the hands of physicians and hospitals, but I'm quite sure it's going to get into the hands of patients and the public. And I'm wondering how you think that safety in that environment can be assured. And that kind of morphs into this bigger issue of concerns about misinformation, disinformation, trust in science and medicine and authority.
So you brought to the other side of the coin, and that's fantastic. And I agree with you entirely that, we need as clinicians to be able to speak to our patients better and explain how we use the information. So if someone comes in with, this is the information that the AI produced or the internet said, what is the best treatment? Working with the Fleming Initiative, which is a UK-based initiative on antimicrobial resistance right now. And the UN just last week had a resolution that said this could be the biggest problem if we lose the ability of our antibiotics to treat infections. By 2050, we could have greater number of deaths than cancer. How do we teach people that you shouldn't take an antibiotic if it's a viral illness? So, I think we need to learn how to communicate better the uncertainty we have in medicine. And as the American Board of Internal Medicine, and I've done a lot of work with Commissioner Califf, we need to do better at convincing people what is truth and what is misinformation. So I hope we can do that in the age of AI, because I know that you're correct. It's going to be both the clinicians using it, but also the patients coming to us with, here's my diagnosis, tell me why I'm wrong.
Yeah, or here's my diagnosis, give me what I want. And or people aren't even going to go to the doctor. They're going to say, the AI tells me this is what I should do or what I shouldn't do, and they're just going to do.
Correct. And it will be interesting. How do we know which algorithms to trust, what we should buy, both for the hospital, but for us as individuals? And I know I still verify everything I read on the internet.
Well, you don't have to worry about what BioCentury writes, but you have to verify everything. Thanks a lot, Lee. It's a great conversation. We've gone a little bit over time already, so I'll let you go. But I really appreciate your time and your thoughtfulness.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
The BioCentury Show is brought to you by the 11th China Healthcare Summit. This October, BioCentury, Bay Helix, and Insights partner, McKinsey & Company, invite you to Shanghai to network, partner, and debate with industry peers and get a first-hand look at China's life sciences ecosystem as deal-making between China and the West accelerates.
Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for the BioCentury Show. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.